It was almost real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast, episode 109. Hello, and welcome to this episode of It Was Almost Real, the Pro Wrestling History Podcast. My name is Ken Zimmerman Jr., and this is the podcast dedicated to the history of professional wrestling between the 1860s and 1930. And in this episode, I will be discussing the 19th century wrestler D.A. McMillan. But first, it's been in the news over the last few weeks about a gambling scandal involving the UFC where a heavily favored fighter was going into a match, and a few, I don't know, days, a week before the match, the betting swung heavily towards his opponent, who was the underdog in the fight, to the point that the swing was so egregious that Dana White in the UFC reached out to the favored fighter and asked if everything was all right, what was going on. And that fighter assured him, no, nothing, everything's great, and nothing's going on. They have the fight, and the heavily favored fighter is trounced in like a couple of minutes, and the betting comes in heavily in favor of the underdog, where it made a lot of money. The UFC ended up reporting this to the FBI, and they have begun an investigation. The fighter who was involved has already been cut from the promotion. Now, I think we're kind of jumping the gun and making assumptions when we should let the investigation play out, because if the person just got beat, then you've just taken away their livelihood on a suspicion. But the story reminded me of why wrestling started being worked in the first place. And that is not the only gambling scandal going on right now. There's a gambling scandal involving the NBA. There's a gambling scandal involving some baseball pitchers. There's a gambling scandal involving some referees. Whenever you have sports and there's sports betting, you are going to have the potential for bad actors to try to fix fights, fix games, uh, manipulate the point spread. All of those things can happen. Now, I'm not arguing that we should go back and have sports betting become illegal, because let's face it, one of the biggest gambling scandals of all time, was the 1919 Black Sox scandals, where members of the Chicago White Sox helped to fix the World Series. And that occurred when gambling was illegal almost everywhere in the United States. So making it illegal isn't going to change anything. Actually, being legal actually makes it easier to deal with these attempts to fix the sport, because when gambling was illegal and people were getting bilked out of their money, I mean, I saw this when I was investigating the John Mabry gambling ring in 1910. They had, I'm going to do this off of memory, but I'm going to say they had bilked sports bettors out of probably 250 to $300,000, which was several $1 million in today's money. And of course, the victims at first were reluctant to report to the authorities, because what they were doing was taking part in illegal gambling. And in some of these instances, they were the dupes, where someone had supposedly given them inside information that a wrestling match was fixed or a horse race was fixed. You had somebody that couldn't lose. Of course, it didn't come out that way, and the person lost, a large bet that they had placed with this gambling ring. When it's illegal and you're participating in an illegal activity, you're less likely to come forward. When it's legal, like it is now, the UFC themselves came forward to the FBI and said, we don't think this is right. You should really investigate this. So I think that's an improvement. But that's why wrestling was originally worked. Now, after the modern promotional system starts to develop in the 19 teens and really in the 1920s, that's when wrestling is becoming worked because people want to control the world title and they want to control the wrestlers. But prior to that, and they're still taking part in gambling schemes too. Gambling schemes went on until the 30s, at least in professional wrestling. They've gone on today in just about every sport. But in wrestling, there was still gambling going on in wrestling up until the 1930s. But it was more an issue of control than it was an issue of gambling. In the 19th century and in the first at least decade of the 20th century, probably the first 20 years, because they made a ton of money off of that second Gotch Hackenschmidt match when all of the gambling was supposed to have been canceled. That's why Hackenschmidt agreed to go on with the match because he was injured and was going to be severely compromised in this match. Jack Curley, who was involved in the promotion and who was ostensibly managing Hackenschmidt for this match, still sent his workers out into the arena that day to try to generate bets on Hackenschmidt. And according to what Curley told Marcus Griffin, 20 years later in the 1930s, he made $30,000 on that match, even though he had announced in the newspaper 2 days before that all of the bets were canceled. Hopefully, they get to the bottom of this one and we'll find out if the fighter was indeed involved in some funny business. I don't think we should make gambling, sports betting illegal. I think that the way it is now, it makes it more easy to prosecute people that are trying to manipulate the sporting events for the ill-gotten gain. I tried to watch NXT Halloween Havoc, and during my review today, it's going to get more into. I'm pretty much going back to the way things were about 10 or 15 years ago. But I didn't get past the second match in NXT Halloween Havoc, which is kind of a shame because I did want to see the main event between Ricky Saints and Trick Williams, but I never got that far. So the card starts out with a tag team match, Javon Evans and I can never remember the kid's first name. His last name is Slater against LA Park and Mr. Iguana from AAA. And when you're watching this match, you're going to see a lot of preposterous things. You're going to see a lot of high flying moves. And so if there's Gafugly to go on in the card, that's the match for the Gafugly to go on. If you're going to have funny business, that's where it should be. The next match I was expecting to be more serious. It was a match between Ethan Page, who's, I believe, the North American champion right now, and the son of Dr. Wagner Jr., the third generation of the Dr. Wagner. So Dr. Wagner, the original, was a huge star in Mexican Lucha Libre. And his son, Dr. Wagner Jr., was also a huge star. And now their the original Dr. Wagner's grandson and Dr. Wagner's son is wrestling as El Hijo, son of Dr. Wagner Jr. Dr. Wagner the third, he probably would be if he was here in the United States. He is a pretty good wrestler. I've enjoyed watching him on the AAA cards that have been on YouTube. So I am excited for this match. I'm like, oh, this ought to be pretty good. You'll see some high flying stuff. You'll see some pretty innovative wrestling because Paige is a good wrestler too. And they start off the match where El Hijo, Dr. Wagner Jr., takes Ethan Page to the ground and kind of ties him up in this move where his arm is stuck between his legs, this is a legitimate grappling move. I've done it uh, rolling around in the mats at class and just playing around with my kids and grandkids. This is a legitimate hold you can put on somebody. But then Dr. Wagner releases it and goes outside the ring to grab a chair. So Paige is sitting there on his face with the one hand stuck between his legs, on his hands, basically on his knees and his face, and is pulling his arm like his arm is still stuck between his legs. Rickson Gracie, the greatest jiu-jitsu fighter who ever lived, cannot tie you up in a knot that you cannot get out of if he is not holding on to you in any way. But Ethan Page, a couple of times, pulls his arm like he can't get his arm out from between his legs, which gives Dr. Wagner time to go outside the ring, grab a chair, place it up against his butt, and then do a drop kick against the freaking chair. And I'm like, well, if they're not going to be serious today, I'm done with this. And I turned it off. So I do need to go back and at least watch the Ricky Saint versus Trick Williams match. But I was so disgusted with that, I just turned the whole thing off and realized I grew up on St. Louis wrestling where it was always treated as a sport. You didn't have a lot of the funny business going on. You definitely didn't have the garbage wrestling going on. And I guess that's forever ruined me for maybe some of the silly things that go on today. But I turned it off. I couldn't get into it. And I'll save the rest for the review because I'm going to get into where I'm at on modern wrestling, period. Next week is going to be the Thanksgiving week episode, and the boys are supposed to be, my sons, Caleb and Trey, are supposed to be joining me for that one. And we're going to be reviewing the first Survivor Series main event from 1987 between Hogan's team and Andre's team. And I picked that because it is available on YouTube. I try to make sure that when we do those kind of reviews, that whatever we're doing is available on YouTube. So that's going to be that's going to be the review for next week. That will not be the main topic. The main topic I'm planning to discuss is Ad Santel's trip to Japan in early 1921 and some of the issues that he ran into there because of resistance from the Kodokan. So that will be next week's episode. So for my main content this week, it's very apropos because I first found out about this wrestler in relation to a gambling scheme. And the gambling scheme that they were involved in, I've also heard of being pulled off by the original Dutch Mantel, by Fred Grubmeyer, who was one of the odder looking professional wrestlers you've ever seen in your life. But this seemed like it had been a common scam back in professional wrestling. So this was a common gambling scheme that had been pulled off by a number of people. But before I talk about the gambling scheme, so D.A. McMillan is almost unknown today. He was either billed as D.A. McMillan or Duncan A. McMillan. And he wrestled from the 1880s up until the first decade of the 20th century. So I have him wrestling in San Francisco. Basically, he always wrestled on the West Coast for the most part, except when he was working with Martin Farmer Burns to dupe people out of their money. He based himself out of San Francisco, although I believe he started out uh, being a local wrestler in La Grande, Oregon. That seems to be at least where he was living as a teenager. But McMillan was a solid journeyman wrestler, but really was never any kind of champion. He is very little is known about him. So we do not know where he was born, where he died, or even if Duncan A. McMillan is his real name. I came across Duncan McMillan because one, he did wrestle a number of the top wrestlers of the 1880s and 1890s, almost always in a losing effort. In the, I think it was 1895, sounds right. He was involved in a gambling scheme with Martin Farmer Burns, who was the current American heavyweight wrestling champion. And so what McMillan did, and this was the common gambling scheme I have heard attributed to Dutch Mantel. I've heard it attached to Freddie Grubmeyer. So these wrestlers, and in this case it's D.A. McMillan, wrestling under a different name. He wasn't wrestling under D.A. McMillan when he pulled off this gambling scheme. They would go into the town a week or so before they were going to pull their scheme. And they would just be a real loudmouth around town, talking about what a great athlete they were. And they would challenge somebody to a foot race. And there would be gambling on the foot race, and they would lose that. And so people are starting to think, oh, this loudmouth idiot, they can't do anything. So then he might challenge somebody to an arm wrestling contest. And then he get his butt beat there. But he's throwing all this stuff on purpose so that he can make people think he's just a loudmouth idiot and a dupe, and they can sucker him. Everybody wants to sucker somebody, is the operating principle that these gamblers always had. And they wanted to make people think they were playing them when in reality they were playing the people. And so in this particular scheme, it was a little different. So in the so a Dutch Mantel, he would lose a few of these contests, and then he would lead in with, well, you guys got the best of me in this and that and this, but there's one thing I excel at better than anybody around, and that's wrestling. Well, most of these towns had a local wrestler or two. And so everybody would be like, oh, well, the best wrestler we got around here is, Joe. Oh, well, I'd love to wrestle Joe. So they would go get Joe, and he would continue to boast and be loud. So by now, he's lost two or three bets. So everybody's like, this guy is ready to get just absolutely fleeced by us. So you got people calling people to come in and bet on this match and blah, 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 blah. And so once all the money was put up and everything was, and then Dutch Mantel would go out there, wrestle the local wrestler, break his wrist, collect all the money, and leave town. Freddie Grubmeyer was also known to do this, and Freddie Grubmeyer was a carnival wrestler who left the carnivals. He was an odd looking guy because he was very tall. I want to say he was 6'4", but he probably weighed about 190 pounds, maybe 180. He was tall and thin, and I have heard him described by a number of people like Luthez as a human stork. And I have seen a picture of him. It's just a picture of his face and his shoulders, but he looks thin, and he does look just a little bit different. And so people would look at him, and he was not what they would think about when they would think about a professional wrestler because he was so thin. So he would go around to these athletic shows in these carnivals, and he dressed in overalls and stuff, and they just thought, oh, there's some rude farm boy here. And he would go into these carnival shows, and he knew all the tricks because he had grown up in the carnivals, learning carnival wrestling. Don't go by the side of the tent. They'll hit you with a 2x4. Don't do this. Don't do that. And once you get the money, get out of town because they'll send people to waylay you and try to get the money back. Grubmeyer, when he would go into these at shows and challenge these professionals, and then he would, do what Dutch did, break a rib, break a wrist, he would immediately grab the money, and then him, and he normally had somebody there with him. They already had a means of it getting out of there, whether they had train tickets and there was a train waiting, whether they had a carriage waiting to take them over to the next town where they could make other arrangements. They had a way to leave those athletic shows very quickly. Because remember, professional wrestling, I've said a number of times, has always been a dirty business. And these athletic show owners were not in the business to lose money. And if you beat their champion, they figured you were taking their money. So they had no problem sending some thugs to try to take their, in parentheses, money back. So whenever they were doing these schemes, they made sure they had a way to get out of there fast. And that's kind of what happened in this gambling scheme, although it didn't involve any of the local wrestlers. It involved the current American heavyweight champion. So McMillan gets there under a different name a week before Burns is going to come through. And Burns is just like touring the area and talking to people as he goes to, I think it was St. Paul. It must have been. Because how this was exposed, I'll say, after we talk about what actually happened. So he was on his way to St. Paul for a title defense. He goes through a rather a medium-sized town. Let's say there's a few thousand people there instead of a few hundred. And over the past week, McMillan has been playing the fool and the loudmouth who's losing all these bets on foot races and arm wrestling and everything. Well, he supposedly just out of the blue discovers that Farmer Burns is going to be coming through town. And he starts telling everybody, "Oh, that Burns is overrated. I'm a great wrestler, and I am going to beat the American heavyweight champion when he comes into town." So they're thinking this guy is a lunatic. Well, Burns pulls into town on the train. McMillan is there and starts challenging him in that. And Burns says, "Okay, loudmouth, you think you can beat me? We'll do a 3 out of 5 match here tomorrow." Now, no one in town is wondering why would the American heavyweight champion take a challenge from some schlub in the crowd? If somebody found out that that was going on, wouldn't somebody be waiting at every train station in a town that he pulled into to challenge him for the title? Maybe they would get lucky. Maybe he's tired. Maybe he'll trip going to the ring. No one thinks about this. They just think, oh, the American heavyweight champion is getting ready to teach this schlub a lesson. So the next day they go into the ring. And when they would bet, they didn't just bet on who would win the match. There were bets on first fall. There were bets on quickest fall. I don't think that they vote or they bet on whether it would be a pin or a submission until later. I don't remember that. I just remember for this particular scheme, they were definitely betting on first fall and quickest fall, besides who would win the match. They get into the McMillan and Burns get into the ring, and so the betting is heavy. Burns is going to take the first fall. And surprise, surprise, D.A. McMillan, wrestling under this false name, beats Martin Farmer Burns for the first fall in probably 20 minutes. I mean, they tried to make it look good, but people still realized that they were being duped by the end of it. He beats him in like 20 minutes. So the people are just shocked. And Burns looks suitably shocked in the ring after this happens. And it's a best 3 out of 5 fall match. So the next 2 falls, Burns wins. And he wins the second or the third fall, not the second fall. He wins the third fall in like 2 minutes. So when they're back there uh, for the intermission, remember, the bet's still coming in on the quickest fall because we don't know that the 2 minutes in the third fall will be the quickest fall. So people can still be betting it. Of course, everybody is betting on Burns. They come out for the fourth fall, and D.A. McMillan beats Burns in 1 minute 25 seconds. It was fast. It beat the 2 minute pin by like 30 seconds. And they look suitably shocked, but now there's murmuring in the crowd. Now they're starting to suspect, wait a minute. How did this possibly happen? How did he possibly beat Burns in 1 minute 30 seconds after Burns dominated him for the last 2 falls? Knowing that the crowd is murmuring and knowing that this is not going to go well, Burns wins the second fall in 2 minutes to make sure that, they preserve the quickest pinfall for McMillan. And then McMillan and Burns leave the arena separately, but very quickly, and they head to the train station and they get out of town. Unfortunately for them, a reporter for the St. Paul Globe, which was one of the better publications covering wrestling in the 19th and 20th century, the Omaha Daily Bee and the St. Paul Globe were the two of the best newspapers for covering professional wrestling. The people that wrote for those papers knew wrestling pretty well, and so the coverage you get is in those two publications. And maybe the New York Evening World was pretty good too. But those publications tend to have the best pro wrestling coverage in that time. Well, the reporter, who's very knowledgeable about professional wrestling, happened to be in the crowd and immediately recognized that the wrestler who was not wrestling as D.A. McMillan is D.A. McMillan. And he exposes that in the newspapers, which not only hurt Burns in St. Paul, it killed wrestling in a lot of Minnesota for a few years. And a lot of the newspapers ran that story, so everybody had heard about how Burns and McMillan had pulled off this gambling scheme on a bunch of unsuspecting people in Minnesota, and it made them really unpopular for a while. Eventually, people forget, and they did forget, and Burns would go back to being a beloved figure eventually. But for a while, he really had a lot to live down with this reputation for being a shady wrestler. McMillan, because he's not as well known, doesn't have as much to live down, but it didn't help him either. So, who is Duncan McMillan? Well, in a lot of respects, we really don't know, but there is, I found coverage of what I think is his first professional match in August 1883. So, on Wednesday, August 8th, 1883, if we can believe the newspaper record, the first professional wrestling match in the state of Oregon occurs in Portland, Oregon at the Mechanics Pavilion on a Wednesday night. And 1,500 fans, including, they said, ladies, which was not always that common in the 19th century. A lot of times, ladies, believe it or not, were barred from sporting events. Draws a pretty good crowd. And Donald Denis is a Scottish wrestler who's fairly well known, but the promoter did not tell them who the other opponent was going to be. It was just a manager named Steckman had a mysterious opponent for Denis to wrestle. And it turned out that mysterious opponent was D.A. McMillan. Donald Denis seems to be a specialist in Scottish backhold. McMillan was more skilled at collar and elbow. Denis was more skilled at Scottish backhold, and then they had Greco-Roman falls in there as well to try to even things up. As you know, both guys had a competition or a competitive advantage in one of the sport or one of the styles of wrestling. This arrangement was very common in the 19th century because you had a number of wrestlers specializing in different styles. So you'd have a William Muldoon, who was a Greco-Roman wrestling specialist. You would have a Surakichi Matsuda, who was a specialist in Japanese wrestling, which was actually sumo wrestling, not the jiu-jitsu matches we think of today. You would have collar and elbow specialists, back hold specialists, side hold. Catch did not become the dominant style until the 1890s in the United States. Greco-Roman was actually the more dominant style, but you had a very developed group of collar and elbow wrestlers. And so I would say those were the three most common styles, I would say, were Greco-Roman, and then probably collar and elbow, and then catch wrestling, but then catch would eventually surpass all of them. Because these guys are both have a specialty, they would throw in a Greco-Roman fall to kind of even things up. What I found out about this is so normally in one of these matches, it would be best 3 out of 5 falls, sometimes best 5 out of 7, but normally best 3 out of 5 falls. And it would be 2 falls, collar and elbow, 2 falls, Greco-Roman. and then I'm sorry, two falls, collar and elbow, two falls, side hold, Scottish back hold, and then one fall Greco-Roman wrestling, figuring that they would tie 2-2, and then you would do the Greco-Roman to settle the match. One of the things that was odd about this match is there didn't seem to be like a set number of falls that they were wrestling, because as you will see, they wrestled for quite a long time. So the match starts out, and it is collar and elbow, which is McMillan's favorite style. And McMillan throws the knee in 3 minutes and 5 seconds. So obviously he's the superior wrestler in collar and elbow. The second bout is Scottish back hold, and they wrestle in a harness. This was common for side hold and back hold wrestling. Instead of jackets, you would be tied together in a harness. And Denis, unsurprisingly, got McMillan off his feet to win the second fall in 1 minute 43 seconds. Now both men are tied at one fall apiece, so they go to a Greco-Roman fall. And both men are pulling on each other, tugging on each other, but it's an upper body throwing style. So it's not as easy because you can't use the legs or anything else. You're throwing somebody with their upper body holds below the waist or band. It takes 14 and a half minutes before Denis wins the Greco-Roman fall. So he's up 2 falls to 1. Fourth fall was collar and elbow again. It lasts 2 minutes and 31 seconds. And now McMillan, they're back tied 2 falls apiece. So I thought, okay, well, the next fall, but it's going to be back hold. It looks like Denis is going to win this match. McMillan was obviously comes in and he gets thrown right away. So now Denis is up 3 falls to 2. And I think, okay, but there's more. They go and they do Greco-Roman. And this time McMillan is able to reverse it and he goes over. So now they're 3 falls apiece. This went on for 11 falls. And finally, in the last bout, which was Greco-Roman, it lasted 34 minutes and 17 seconds. And McMillan was awarded that 11th and final fall. So they went 5 falls apiece before McMillan won the match. And they were talking about setting up a second match after this because people wanted to see it again. This was definitely an odd match in the way that it was set up. It was not commonly the way it was set up in the 19th century, but I mean, this is the first professional wrestling match in the state. It's quite possible that the organizers were not as familiar with how cards normally ran. Was also the only match on the card. So it was a one match card. So maybe they were afraid, oh, if this just goes 5 falls, people are going to be disappointed. So they tried to put 2 or 3 matches in one fall. I have no idea if they were working this match or not. Doesn't seem to be when you look at the accounts. And it doesn't sound like it was the most exciting match, although people seem to enjoy it. It looked like the only matches that were really somewhat interesting were the Greco-Roman matches because you knew that Denis was going to win all of the Scottish backhold, and you knew that McMillan was going to win all of the collar and elbow, which is done in jackets like maybe Sambo. So then you're going to the Greco-Roman wrestling matches to decide who's going to win this. And it looks like that those were probably the most exciting matches of the night. And those were the ones that also went a little bit. One went 14 minutes. I think one went One went 10 minutes and one went 34 minutes. Because how this came out was they did four falls each in their specialty. So they wrestled four Scottish backhold falls. They wrestled four falls under collar and elbow rules. And then they wrestled three Greco-Roman wrestling falls, which were the falls that decided the match. And of those three matches, McMillan won two, Denis won one. So my recommendation for this week is a part of a podcast series that I have been listening to. So I've been a regular listener to the Shut Up and Wrestle podcast with Brian R. Solomon. I enjoy his podcast for a lot of the history content. And he is doing a series on the NWA World Champions. I believe the first one he did was on Orville Brown, and I believe he had a historian on. For Luthez, he had one of Luthez's last students, and they talked quite a bit about Luthez's career. For Dick Hutton, he brought on Mike Chapman, who's a well respected wrestling historian. And then for the Pat O'Connor episode, I have not had a chance to listen to yet, but I'm going to do that this afternoon while I'm working on the second edition of the St. Louis Streetcar Strike book, the St. Louis Civil War book. I'm going to listen to that episode this afternoon. I'm interested in Pat O'Connor because besides the fact that he was the longtime booker in St. Louis during the 70s and early 80s, he was one of the people that Sam Muchnick sold the promotion to in January of 1982. And while as a promoter, he would have a lot to be desired, mainly because he followed the lead of his longtime partner and a good friend, Bob Geigel, who ran the Kansas City office, which was the Monogram Pictures of professional wrestling at the time. They made no money there. It was known as a place for very low payoffs, very low crowds. It continued to slide until they finally sold it to Crockett in 1986. I think when they bought St. Louis, they thought that they were going to be able to become a very profitable destination promotion, which maybe they could have if they had run St. Louis like it had always been run, instead of trying to run it like it was a subsidiary of Central States Professional Wrestling, which was not good. Their shows were terrible. Their talent was either way older or green as grass. And when they started trying to put Bulldog Bob Brown and Rufus R. Jones in the main event, it was the kiss of death for the St. Louis promotion. Pat didn't get a lot of that heat. I think most people blamed Bob Geigel because they could look over at the Kansas City and see what kind of shows they were running and realize, oh, Geigel is pushing this. And had they listened to Larry Matisick, they probably would have done a much better job. But instead of listening to Larry, they thought they could run it like Central States, and it blew up in their face. So if you get a chance and you like podcasts, I definitely recommend that NWA Champion series. And so now for the review, I watched the Saturday night's main event on November 1st, 2025. And I have to say, I was pretty disappointed, but I've been pretty disappointed with WWE lately overall. I think it's kind of hit a bit of a slump. I do think that it's still better than it was under, Vince for the last 10 years, but it just has not been as compelling as it first was. And overall, I just think the shows have lacked a little bit of something. I was looking in Netflix the other day and realized I had not watched a Raw episode since early September 2025. And so I'll give you a very brief thoughts on my, or very brief overview of my thoughts on the card. And then I'm going to talk about reviewing any of the premium live pay-per-view, or any of the modern wrestling going forward. So the card is a four-match card, which is more reminiscent of the 1920s instead of the 2020s. And I think WWE is going in the right way because I think that Tony Khan puts way too much content on his pay-per-views, and WWE is not putting quite enough on there. I think the sweet spot has always been about 6 to 7 matches. I think that's the ideal pro wrestling card, whether you're going to a house show or whether you're watching a premium live event or pay per view. 14 matches with, 100 wrestlers is way too much. The opening match was a great match. So Cody Rhodes versus Drew McIntyre would hold up in any era of professional wrestling. The problem is it was moved up because of issues with Seth Rollins getting hurt. So they didn't have time for a sufficient build. And I don't think anybody thought that Drew McIntyre was going to beat Cody Rhodes in this match. So there's not much intrigue, enthusiasm, ooh, got to see this. It's just going to be another great match between two of the better professional wrestlers in the business. And at the end, Drew will lose again. And maybe this will lead to something down the road, or maybe they're going to move on to something else. The second match, it's obvious that WWE loves the look of Jade Cargill as she was wrestling Tiffany Stratton for Tiffany's version of the World Women's Championship. And Jade goes over Tiffany in 4 minutes. I don't have a real issue with Jade going over Tiffany. What I have is they, have her squash her in 4 minutes. And yes, Tiffany was supposed to be having an injury prior to the match, but they have spent so much time building up Tiffany, who got over initially on her own. There wasn't a big build for her. She was going to be a mid card performer, but she got over with the fans as Nia Jax's little buddy, and the creative team picked up on that and built on that. And then you have Jade go out and squash her in 4 minutes. I don't think that helps her. And I don't know that that's going to be really something that helps Jade either, because I don't know how many of the fans are going to like that. So the third match was probably my favorite match, which is very odd because it was a three-way match, and I hate three-way matches. And it was Dominic Mysterio versus Penta versus. So let me take a brief pause here to say that I will never ever buy another Vizio television as long as I live. So twice now, as I'm recording this, the TV in the room I'm working in just all of a sudden had been muted and was just going in the background, popped on twice on me with nobody touching a remote that's not even by me. And that's what you get with these Vizio TVs. They freeze up for no reason. They're a gigantic pain in the neck. So I just want to say to the makers of Vizio, you guys do not make a great product. And I cannot wait till when I replace this thing to replace it with a much better television. So to get back to the three-way, the match was Dominic Mysterio versus Penta versus Miro. That's not his name anymore. What is his name now in WWE? It's Rusev. I knew it would come to me eventually. Sorry about that. This TV thing got me aggravated. It was my favorite match, though, because it was the continuing development of Dominic, who has become a great heel. And the match looked like it was going to be over with Rusev pinning Penta and winning the Intercontinental title when the bell starts ringing and the referee looks all puzzled and Rusev jumps up like he just won the match because he had a submission on that nobody saw Penta give up to, because he didn't. Because you look out at ringside, the camera pans over to where the uh, ringside timekeeper is, and it's Dominic with the hammer in his hand ringing the bell. And it was so reminiscent of some of the better stuff that Eddie Guerrero was doing in 2000 in the 2000s in WWE. That it was really a nice moment. And Dominic uses a distraction to get in there, steal a win again and beat Penta and run out with the Intercontinental title. My favorite match, even though normally I would not even have watched that match, but Dominic has become a joy to watch. And then finally, the last match on the card was CM Punk versus Jey Uso for the vacant world title, left vacant by Seth Rollins' injury. And this was my least favorite match on the card, not because of what they did in the ring. They were excellent as always. Both guys are super over, but they're two of my favorite wrestlers. I didn't really want either one of them to lose. And because I didn't want to see either one of them lose, it really took my joy away from CM Punk winning the world title, which I thought was going to be the outcome. Not arguing with the outcome. I just don't think the booking has done Jay too many favors over the last 4 or 5 months. With all that being said, going forward, I don't think there's going to be any more reviews of modern wrestling because, for the most part, I'm going back to where I was in the late 2000s and I am going to tap on modern professional wrestling. Doesn't mean I won't watch the occasional AAA card on YouTube. Maybe I'll make a mention of something. But reviews of modern wrestling are going to go out the door. I'm not reviewing any of them. And there's a couple reasons for it. One, I'm not really compelled to watch either product right now from the two big companies. Number two, I am not paying the ridiculous amounts of money to chase around WWE programming. So there is not a chance on this earth that I am going to spend $30 a month to get that new ESPN app to watch a premium live event or any other sporting event. ESPN and Disney and their greedy little corporate shills can keep their app. I have no intention of ever paying for that. Two, there is some good stuff on Max, but there is a limit to how much streaming channels you can have. I'm thinking of ways to try to cut some of the ones I already have because it just becomes too much at some point. And while I did find good programming on Max, for the most part, I couldn't justify keeping a service that I was the only one that was probably going to watch. And I had it only because, well, that's not true. There is Boomerang on there for my grandkids, and that's one of the reasons I had it initially. But they don't watch that much anymore. They actually watch MeTV Tunes, watch the classic cartoons on MeTV Tunes channel. And the AEW programming is, to me, too long. But I do feel guilty that I don't keep Max, and I can see more of the WWE product with the stuff I already have than the AEW. So it doesn't seem fair to review WWE shows and not to be doing the same for the AEW shows. I didn't like that either. And then finally, I want to cut down on the stuff I have to chase around. You can spend a lot of time trying to find some of these modern shows to review. And there are a lot of other podcasts that people probably listen to that are going to review the same shows. So there's no need for me to be doing that. This is a history podcast. I need to be more focused on history. If we're going to review anything, it'll either be from the 1980s or before. I would love to review some of the great matches of the 20s and 30s. There's just not very much film or uh, any film really on that era. So most of the time, you may get a couple matches from the 40s if you're lucky. The matches that exist from the 30s are really cut down versions of those actual matches. So you'll see a 5 minute or a 13-minute clip from a match in 1938. That match went 2.5 hours. You're just seeing the highlights from that match on those clips. And so matches in their entirety, we really don't get until the 1950s. And so much of those wrestling shows from the 60s and 70s from the territories are lost because before VHS tape, there was no way for people to record it, and most of the promotions and the TV stations never saved it. They just taped over it. But if we do have reviews, it'll be for older stuff. So, like next week's episode, we're going to review the original Survivor Series from 1988 between Hogan's team and Andre's team. And I do want the boys, I don't know how good that was, but it was compelling at the time because it was continuing the feud. Actually, I said 88. That was 87 because that was the Survivor Series before the Saturday night's main event in early 88 where Andre beat Hogan with the dual referees. So I misspoke. That's not the 88 Survivor Series, it's the 87 Survivor Series. That's going to be it for this episode. You can see the show notes at kenzermanjr.com/episode 109. If you want to ask me a question or send a comment, you can do that at Ken, at kenzermanjr.com. And until next time, take care, everybody. Bye bye.